fate of Yemen's worsening humanitarian crisis hangs on the fight.
This port, of course, crucial to bringing in food to much of the population.
These are the drawn, deadly faces of a war the world forgot.
It's not getting the attention it deserves. The more people are dying in silence.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're tracking this week. The war in Yemen. Will the latest coalition offensive finally get this story the kind of coverage it deserves? Journalism in Syria suffers from a different kind of problem. Does the truth even stand a chance there? A brutal murder of a Kashmiri editor sends a chilling message to anyone trying to report from the region. And an American cartoonist becomes collateral damage in Donald Trump's war against the U.S. media. He's out of a job. For a conflict described by Amnesty International as the forgotten war, Yemen has found itself in an unusual place over the past week, in the news. The reason for that is the assault by the combined forces of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates on the port city of Hodeidah. The UN already calls Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and that port is where Yemenis get 70% of their aid supplies. While it's the Saudi-led coalition that has waged this war from the air over the past 3 years, hitting multiple civilian targets, many media outlets describe Yemen as a proxy war, which is why you'll be familiar with the term Iran-backed Houthi rebels. But how much attention has been given to the United States and the United Kingdom, whose weapon sales and military assistance have enabled wealthy Gulf monarchies to wage war against the poorest country in the Middle East? For British and American journalists, that should make Yemen a foreign war with plenty of domestic angles. But you wouldn't know it from the kind of coverage and the overall lack of it. Our starting point this week is Hodeidah.
Troops are fighting to retake the key port city of Hodeidah.
The coastal city of Hudaida has been held by Houthis backed by Iran.
The return of the war in Yemen to news agendas has been long overdue. It took a new target, the port at Hodeidah, to do it.
They're trying to capture the city of 600,000 people, putting their lives at risk, but also putting the lives of 22 million people at risk who depend on that aid coming from Hodeidah.
Yemen has always been a forgotten story. It's been extremely difficult for international media to go to Yemen. How can you tell that story if you don't have people operating in those areas? And that, for me, is the biggest challenge when covering the military campaign against the Houthis in Yemen.
I don't think the lack of coverage is explained by the fact that it's difficult for journalists to get into the country. When there's an airstrike on a school, or a hospital, or a marketplace, or a home, I can find pictures of that because people in Yemen take pictures of that. That's not the problem. The problem is an unwillingness to show the US or UK role in the conflict.
The Shiite Muslim Houthis, supported by Iran.
On the role of outsiders, one of the most skewed representations in this conflict has been the Western media's constant use of the term Iran-backed Houthi rebels.
Iranian-backed Houthi rebels.
Iranian-backed rebels in Yemen.
Iranian-aligned rebels in Yemen.
This began as a civil war, Yemeni against Yemeni, in 2015. Within weeks, the Saudis, leading a military coalition of 9 countries, intervened and made it regional. One of their justifications was that Iran was supporting the Houthi side. There was little or no evidence for that at the time. However, as the war dragged on, Iran's involvement has grown. Still, the support Tehran provides the Houthis pales in comparison to the backing the Saudis and the UAE get from Washington and London. Between them, since the war began, the US and the UK have sold more than $12 billion worth of weapons to the Saudis alone, including some of the warplanes and the payloads they drop. The American military also provides mid-air refueling for Saudi and UAE aircraft, and both British and US personnel assist the Saudis as they target their strikes, hundreds of which have killed civilians.
Warplanes from a Saudi-led coalition are taking off for Yemen.
But on the relatively rare occasions when Western news outlets actually cover the story, have they ever used the term US and UK-backed, Saudi, and UAE forces.
The conflict has been cast in ways that have been very misleading to a US or UK audience. People don't realize how involved our governments are in creating this catastrophe in Yemen. It's construed as something that just is happening somewhere to people who are fighting each other.
Where an already ugly war has metastasized and is grinding the ruins of life into dust.
Casting it as a sectarian war and more often as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is completely misguided.
The very latest from the fighting in Yemen now, that proxy war really that's raging between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
When you have coverage which doesn't really provide context, which doesn't really provide a proper understanding of the key actors in a conflict and also the role of our own governments, publics are left with a sense of a confused conflict.
What about Saudi air support, though, in terms of bombing Houthi positions? How helpful is that?
Where it's not clear who's right or wrong, it's not clear whether or not we're involved in it. These are big political, economic and military relationships which would cause increasing degrees of public dissent if people were fully aware of what's going on. And you've got to remember there is a close relationship between government officials and journalists.
About 2 million Yemenis.
It's not just the journalists involved, it's the media outlets they work for. CBS's news magazine program, 60 Minutes, is an American journalistic institution now in its 50th year on the air. Last year, it produced an extensive report on Yemen, going where most of the U.S. media have failed to go.
We have managed to get pictures out of Yemen to show you what the Saudi government does not want you to see.
Documenting the humanitarian catastrophe and openly criticizing Saudi Arabia. The report was 13 minutes long, but there was not a single mention of the U.S. role in the conflict, the weapon sales, or the military and logistical support. Not one. MSNBC is a 24-hour news channel Americans consider to be on the liberal side of the political spectrum. In 2017, the network produced exactly one news report on Yemen. One. MSNBC had 8,760 hours of airtime to fill last year. The total time it devoted to the Yemen story and the American angle in it, 3 minutes and 7 seconds.
Now, if you don't know what country I'm talking about, maybe that is because we in the American press don't cover it very much.
The fact that MSNBC refuses to cover Yemen just goes to show you that support for the Saudis and the Emiratis in the United States is not just a liberal or a conservative policy. The fact that journalists are not scrutinizing it more just demonstrates that in American media culture, it really is okay to devalue the lives of people in the Middle East and the people that the United States tramples on to obtain its policy goals. I also think that it's a really shocking failure of journalists to push back on the government's own narratives.
Even apparently critical journalists on MSNBC become very reluctant to cover those issues. They mark out the boundaries of legitimate debate in a very significant way. Time and time again, when we look at media reporting of conflicts, in the case of Vietnam, and then really all the conflicts you have since then, the same pattern has emerged.
So this is the biggest one you have?
You bet. They are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments.
The liberal left not actually getting to the heart of the really important big issues when it comes to high foreign policy and war.
There's a bigger picture at play in Yemen than most of the coverage from the outside world would have you believe. Broader power struggles that bedevil the Middle East. It's not just about Iran, ISIS, or Al-Qaeda. Nor is the lack of coverage solely about the lack of access. There's more to it than that. And however you frame it, media outlets that give the story the short, simplistic shrift are letting their viewers, as well as millions of Yemenis, down.
If you go back to the last 20 years, international media would travel to Yemen.
Al-Qaeda first struck a U.S. target in Yemen in 2000.
Just to cover stories related to Al-Qaeda's presence in Yemen. Apart from that, it was really never on the radar screen of the international media. Suddenly, it was summed up to this fight against a proxy militia used by the Iranians to further destabilize the region. That's not true.
We're 17, 18 years into a series of very major conflicts in the international system following 9/11. And these conflicts have been, in a very significant way, driven by Western governments and their regional allies. And really, it's very, very important that we now start to sort of encourage awareness, understanding that we're not observing a series of disparate, discrete conflicts and so on. We actually have a broader drive from Western governments and their Gulf state allies in order to shore up their control and influence in the region.
This explains why people sometimes don't get the story. Why is this happening and who's backing who and what are the agendas there in Yemen? I've been covering Yemen for the last 15 years and people would always tell me the West does not care about us as Yemenis. They don't care anymore about Yemen.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Flo Phillips. Flo, last week a journalist was murdered in Kashmir, a prominent one. What are the details of this case?
Well, Richard, Shujaat Bukhari was the editor of a local English-language daily, The Rising Kashmir, in Srinagar, the capital of the Indian-administered part of Kashmir. But he'd also become involved in attempts to broker better relations between India and Pakistan. Now, he was shot multiple times by 3 unidentified assassins while sitting in his car outside his office. Both of his bodyguards, who actually had been assigned to him 15 years ago, were also killed. And on that point, a former security chief has since said that Mr. Bukhari had actually requested additional protection from the Indian intelligence service just a few days earlier. He was clearly fearing for his life. Now, I spoke with Anuradha Bahasin, executive editor of Kashmir Times, a professional associate and friend of Bukhari's, and asked her what it was about his journalism that made him a target.
As a journalist, he was fairly professional in his ways and he was reporting things very objectively, and which in a conflict situation like Kashmir, it's not an easy thing to do because there are intimidations and pressures from all sides. The other thing is that Shujaat Bukhari was also wearing 2 hats. It wasn't his professional career in journalism which was as problematic for some people as his peace activism.
And as you mentioned, this guy had 2 bodyguards. They were killed as well. And that must leave Kashmiri journalists wondering if anybody there is safe.
And it's a community of journalists that has suffered decades of threats and intimidation from militants and Indian forces alike. I talked to Ms. Bahasin about that and the effect this may have on journalism in Kashmir.
At a personal level, it's a huge loss. Professionally, I think it's created a huge vacuum. And beyond that, I think it is impacting all of us because it is connected to the collective grief in Kashmir Valley. There is an entire history of human rights abuse that this death signifies, and it has invoked a sense of fear and made us aware about that sense of fear, and that is extremely disturbing.
This past week also saw the U.S. news media consumed by this undocumented migrant story, the thousands of children taken from their parents by the border authorities and placed in detention centers. Despite some access issues that journalists were having on this story, the coverage seems to be pretty much nonstop.
In fact, Richard, all the major US news networks have sent big names down to Texas. Morning shows, nightly newscasts, they're all being anchored or co-hosted from the border. CNN has 7 crews in the region. But you're right, recording inside the detention centres is actually prohibited. So news outlets are stuck using the photos and videos that the border protection authorities are providing. The New York Times tweeted that they weren't going to use the pictures if their own cameramen weren't actually allowed in. What did get a lot of play, however, was a leaked audio recording of children sobbing, published by the investigative outlet ProPublica. And part of that tape was actually played during a White House briefing involving the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen. Not that it moved her. Nielsen then had her own media moment. She was at a restaurant in Washington when protesters shamed her over the separation of families, and it was all caught on camera. And here's the kicker, Richard. The restaurant was Mexican.
Okay, thanks, Flo. There was a time when to see was to believe. That is no longer the case, at least in Syria. In 7 years of fighting there, the bombing of civilians, tales of torture on both sides, millions displaced, it's the chemical weapons attacks that have produced some of the most widely broadcast footage and the most heated debates. The most recent suspected chemical attack occurred 2 months ago in the city of Douma. We saw images of frantic rescue efforts, the hosing down of victims, children included. However, in a war involving multiple states and actors, almost nothing can be taken at face value. Arguments over the authenticity of the footage, the credibility of the analysis, the motives and flaws in the reporting have been intense and ongoing. To call this an information war is to sell it short. It's a news and information storm, and trying to navigate through it is far from easy. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the seeming impossibility of understanding one of the most contentious aspects of the Syrian war, the use of chemical weapons.
On a story as contentious as the war in Syria, where, in addition to bullets, claims and counterclaims fly across battle lines, and where numerous chemical attacks have thrown up serious questions over what evidence from the war zone can be trusted, it is doubly important to consider the source. For this story, we interviewed Rania Khalek, a journalist reporting on the underclass, as she says on her website. She's based in Beirut. Elliot Higgins, a British blogger who started analyzing videos and documents from the Syrian war in 2012. He is now often referred to as a specialist in open source weapons analysis. Christian Benedict, a campaign manager for the NGO Amnesty International. Based in London, his focus for the past few years has been the war in Syria. Max Blumenthal, a journalist and author of numerous books. In an interview, he said what motivates his work is a disgust with unfairness. And Elias Grohl, a DC-based journalist who covers how conflicts play out in the cyberspace. And consider too where you are seeing this story. On The Listening Post, airing on Al Jazeera English, an international news channel funded by the state of Qatar.
There are obviously a range of positions on the use of chemical weapons. Certainly for us at Amnesty International, we're quite clear that chemical weapons have been used predominantly by the Assad regime. There are obviously counter-narratives which are trying to say, no, chemical weapons haven't been used, or chemical weapons have been used by the so-called terrorists.
Meanwhile, American journalists who have visited the area have found no traces of poisonous substances.
My position is that we should be skeptical of everything coming out of Syria, because at the end of the day, there's not people on the ground who actually know what's happening.
Reporters cannot get into the town, civilians cannot get out. So internet videos are the only evidence of their suffering.
All we're hearing from is biased sources, whether it be the Syrian government or whether it be Western governments or insurgents on the ground who have been pushing for regime change. So we should be skeptical of all allegations coming out of this war.
At this hour, American and coalition forces...
15 years ago, in 2003, the United States, under the presidency of George W. Bush, went to war with Iraq. US intelligence agencies claimed Iraqi President Saddam Hussein had been secretly developing weapons of mass destruction.
In fact, they can produce enough dry biological agent in a single month to kill thousands upon thousands of people.
Despite UN weapons inspectors saying they could find no evidence, the mainstream news media, primarily in the US and UK, ran with the Bush administration's version of the story.
The intelligence shows, and the senators can back this up, that there are massive amounts of weapons of mass destruction hidden, buried, unaccounted for.
Those claims proved to be false. They were lies. And the US and British media, along with the governments whose lies they propagated, have been struggling to regain their credibility ever since.
It was this really seminal moment in post 9/11 history in the United States. It shattered trust in government, it shattered trust in media, there was not enough critical reporting.
Explosions, fireballs, mushroom clouds, a fearsome display of American military might.
The Iraq War, it's exhibit A for why it's so important to critically evaluate these types of statements by the government.
I cannot think of one pundit on the national scene in cable news or at any major newspaper who has questioned the drive for regime change in Syria.
He's got Russia and Iran behind him, and we want him out. So we need to tip the balance of power.
And so it's really left to a small group of journalists and online activists to really sift through what we believe is disinformation from our own governments aimed at stimulating a war of regime change.
The sheer volume of information available online about the Syrian war has been unprecedented. Videos, images, uploaded documents, witness testimonies. It has led to the rise of what's called open source investigation, which is analysis of material that is available on the web. One of the best-known websites examining evidence of chemical attacks in Syria is Bellingcat. Elliot Higgins, the founder of the site, spoke with us about the process of open source investigations.
I've spent 6 years looking at chemical attacks in Syria. Generally, you're going to be looking at things like YouTube, Facebook and Twitter accounts. We're also reaching out to groups on the ground who are recording videos, speaking to witnesses, getting a kind of an idea of what the kind of emerging narrative from the attack is. Then we cross-reference that against the actual video footage. So, for example, with Douma, we had 3 or 4 videos showing the interior of the building, but we had to figure out if it was the same building. So there were features in each video that were shared. So we piece all of these together, kind of like a jigsaw.
I am not an expert, I'm not a military expert, I am not an expert in satellite analysis or video analysis, but neither is Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat. We wouldn't accept the medical claims of somebody who hasn't been to medical school. Another problem is that Elliot Higgins and his colleagues at Bellingcat are not on the ground in Syria, which means they lack context, they lack direct witnesses, they lack impartiality, they lack physical evidence.
And one thing I will say, I mean, when it comes to the use of open source material, it does in some way provide a greater ability for the public to understand the evidence. If the use of chemical weapons has been documented in a large body of real-time evidence, then that's something that you as a citizen, you can go and watch, right? And you can ask yourself, well, what happened?
However, online investigations are only as accurate, only as credible as the material they are based on. A lot of what Higgins and others rely on has been provided by the Syrian Civil Defense, a group better known as the White Helmets. They call themselves a neutral, humanitarian group of volunteers rescuing people from the rubble of buildings hit by bombs. A documentary about their work even won an Oscar in 2017. In addition to their rescue missions, the White Helmets post videos from the war zone. Their footage of airstrikes and chemical weapon attacks have been used widely by the media. Many call the White Helmets heroes.
In the face of unrelenting brutality, heroes have emerged.
They're civilians who risk their life to save others.
Others say they are propped up by foreign governments and have strong links with Syrian militias considered terrorists.
The White Helmets are not just a group of ordinary rescue workers. The White Helmets are an international influence operation. And what makes it especially scandalous is that the White Helmets have been funded with at least $23 million from the State Department's Office of Transition Initiatives, which is the regime change arm of the State Department, as well as $55 million from the British Foreign Office, and untold millions from the government of Qatar, the financial parent of Al Jazeera. And the White Helmets have participated in public executions that's been well documented. They have been filmed celebrating alongside members of Jabhat al-Nusra, the Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate, and they have also participated in rescuing people from under the rubble. But that's only part of the organization. This organization should be immediately defunded.
The Syrian conflict is a story where propaganda, misinformation, fake news, and denialism all meet to confuse, obstruct, and sway, often successfully. That multiple chemical weapon attacks have taken place is a fact confirmed by several international organizations. But the who, why, and how angles of these stories take time to investigate and clarify. Details often remain murky for long after the attacks are out of the headlines.
People generally have less time to read an 80-page report from the United Nations. They're going to pick up a tweet which says Jaish al-Islam were responsible for the attack in Douma, and they're going to go with that because they have a sense that that's some information that they can run with. It's easily digestible. It's like the McDonald's of information.
The Syrian war is one of the most covered military conflicts in history. And despite all the information and data available on the 80 cases of chemical attacks documented, The more we read about them, the more we're told about them, the less we feel we actually know. The cliché goes that truth is the first casualty in war. Certainly in the case of Syria, the truth, even the facts, are as contested as the battlegrounds journalists are trying to report on.
And finally, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was clearly not amused, so it fired its editorial cartoonist. Rob Rogers says he was terminated last week for making fun of Donald Trump. According to Rogers, who spent almost a quarter century in the job, the last 6 cartoons that he submitted for publication, including this one showing President Trump separating a child from its migrant family, were all spiked by the editor. The paper said it tried to find what it called a middle way with Rogers, but that he had been unwilling to, quote, collaborate, unquote. And it's worth noting, as the mayor of Pittsburgh did, that the firing came just one day after Trump called the U.S. news media our country's biggest enemy. We'll leave you now with some of the cartoons the Post-Gazette saw unfit to print, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.